Title: The Black Dahlia, L.A.'s Most Notorious Unsolved Murder, 1947. Description: On January 15, 1947, a mother walking with her daughter discovered a body in a vacant lot in Leimert Park, Los Angeles. What followed became one of the most sensationalized and never solved murder investigations in American history. This is the case of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, told through verified police records. Not on the morning of January 15, 1947, a young mother named Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter along a quiet street in Leimert Park, a developing residential neighborhood in Los Angeles. What she saw in the weeds of a vacant lot that morning would trigger one of the largest, most chaotic, and most famous murder investigations in American history. A case that, 77 years later, has never been solved, despite hundreds of suspects, dozens of false confessions, and a media frenzy that arguably did as much to destroy the investigation as it did to fuel it. The victim was 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. She'd grown up in Massachusetts and moved to California chasing the same dream that drew thousands of young women to Los Angeles in the 1940s, a career in the movies. She worked odd jobs, lived in a string of boarding houses and hotel rooms, and by most accounts struggled financially, never quite landing the break she was looking for. In the days before her death, witnesses placed her at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where she was reportedly seen being dropped off by a man in the early evening of January 9th. That sighting is the last confirmed account of her alive. 6 days passed before her body was discovered, and to this day, investigators have never definitively established where she was or who she was with during that gap. Within hours of the discovery, the case exploded into the press. Local newspapers, locked in a fierce circulation war at the time, treated the investigation almost like a competing story to break, rather than a crime to solve carefully. Reporters reportedly arrived at crime scenes and interviewed witnesses before investigators could. The press gave her the nickname that would outlive every other detail of the case, the Black Dahlia, a reference partly to a film noir released around that time and partly to her reported habit of wearing dark clothing. The nickname turned a real woman's death into something closer to a pulp headline, and it's a detail worth sitting with, because the sensationalism that followed her case is, in many ways, inseparable from why it was never solved. The Los Angeles Police Department, already overstretched and operating with the forensic technology of the late 1940s, found itself buried almost immediately under an avalanche of public attention. Hundreds of tips poured in daily. And then came something almost unheard of in any murder investigation before or since. The killer, or someone claiming to be the killer, started writing to the newspapers. A series of letters arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner over the following weeks, some built from cut-out newspaper letters in a manner resembling a ransom note, taunting investigators and the press directly, daring them to catch him. One package reportedly arrived containing items said to belong to Short, including identification documents, though investigators were never able to confirm with certainty whether the sender was the actual killer or simply someone capitalizing on the case's notoriety to insert themselves into the story. This is one of the defining frustrations of the Black Dahlia case. The sheer volume of attention the murder received seems to have attracted copycats, attention seekers, and false confessors faster than investigators could rule them out, muddying a trail that was likely difficult to follow even at the start. And the false confessions kept coming for decades. At one point, the LAPD estimated that more than 60 people had confessed to the murder over the years, almost all of them later disproven through basic inconsistencies with the evidence, timeline, or even basic facts about the victim. Some confessors appeared to be drawn purely by the notoriety the case still carried decades after the fact. It speaks to something genuinely strange about how this particular murder embedded itself in the public imagination, in a way that very few other unsolved cases from that era ever did. Setting aside the confessions, The LAPD's actual suspect list over the decades has included a striking range of people. Doctors were investigated, given the level of precision investigators initially attributed to certain aspects of the crime. Former patients of psychiatric institutions were investigated. A decorated war veteran with a documented history of violent behavior was investigated and, for a period, considered a strong possibility by some detectives working the case. None of these leads ever produced an arrest, let alone a conviction, largely because the physical evidence available in 1947, long before DNA testing existed, simply wasn't sufficient to definitively place any one suspect at the scene. One name that resurfaces frequently in later research is Dr. George Hodel, a Los Angeles physician who was investigated by police at the time, reportedly surveilled, and later named publicly by his own son, retired LAPD detective Steve Hodel, in a series of books published decades after the case went cold. Steve Hodel built his case largely on circumstantial connections, his father's documented history of disturbing behavior, and his own interpretation of old case files he gained access to after his father's death. It's a theory that has drawn significant public attention and media coverage, but it has never been substantiated to the level required for an official posthumous determination, and the LAPD has never reopened the case on the basis of it. It remains one interpretation among several, not a confirmed answer. What's often overlooked in retellings of this case is just how much the investigation itself was compromised by the media environment around it. Evidence handling that would be considered completely unacceptable by modern investigative standards. Reporters allegedly removing or contaminating physical evidence, competing publications racing to print unverified details, the sheer scale of public theorizing, created a situation where even good detective work in 1947 may not have stood much chance against the noise surrounding the case. It's one of the clearest historical examples of a murder investigation effectively competing against its own media coverage. The case technically remains open today, classified as an active cold case within the LAPD's files, which means that in theory, new forensic evidence, SHU, if any still exists and hasn't degraded beyond use after nearly 8 decades, could still be tested using modern techniques unavailable in 1947. In practice, with every potential witness from that era, long since deceased and physical evidence either lost, contaminated, or simply too degraded for modern analysis, most investigators familiar with the case consider the odds of a conviction at this point to be effectively negligible. What makes the Black Dahlia case different from a lot of the cases we cover on this channel isn't necessarily the crime itself. Tragically, unsolved homicides from this era aren't unique. What makes it different is the way it transformed, almost in real time, from a police investigation into a cultural phenomenon, a process that arguably worked against the very goal of finding who was responsible. Decades of books, films, and documentaries have continued to revisit the case, often blending established fact with speculation in ways that have made it increasingly difficult to separate what investigators actually know from what's simply been repeated often enough to feel true. 77 years later, Elizabeth Short's case remains officially open and officially unsolved. If you've come across any of the competing theories in your own research, let us know which one you find most convincing and why, down in the comments. Subscribe, because next time, we're heading into the Pacific Ocean for one of aviation's oldest and most debated disappearances, the case of a woman who vanished trying to fly around the world.